All right, how we doing out there? We doing good? I was sitting there, it's fascinating in the scriptures, you get a snapshot every now and then of heaven. And one of the pictures we're given is that heaven in God's kingdom is a picture of every tribe and tongue and singing. And that literally is what we just witnessed. So exciting for us. If you're new here, my name is Mark Lohman, and I'm the associate pastor here at New Life. The last couple of days, I've been a little under the weather, hence I have a water bottle up here, and I don't usually do that. So if I cough or if I sound a little nasally to you, I apologize. But because I was under the weather, I was able to kind of reflect a little bit on our church, and particularly this series that we've been in, going through the book of 1 Corinthians. And it's fascinating to me that I think there's like this myth out there that we think the scriptures are outdated or boring or irrelevant to culture at large. And just as someone who's been kind of behind the scenes preparing for these messages, it's so clear to me that that's not the case. And so if you've been around the last couple months, you know that we've talked about things like sex, and that sex is actually really good in the context of marriage, that it's God-given, right? And we don't talk about that in the church because it's taboo. The beginning of the book, we talked about divisions, and that certain leaders within Corinth were favoring certain leaders. And of course, divisions today never happen in the American church, right? And then we even talked about singleness. How often do you hear singleness talked about in the church? And so it's been good. I've greatly enjoyed it. We hope that you have as well. And it's even cooler that though we're a little bit more than halfway through the letter now, we still have things like chapter 13, which is the famous chapter on love that you hear preached at weddings. We'll be going into spiritual gifts. So it's just going to be good. We hope you've enjoyed it. And we still have a lot to cover here in the next couple months. If you've been here the last 2 Sundays, you know that we've leaned into the ever-pressing topic of whether you should eat meat that's to a pagan idol in a temple in Corinth. I know all of you, I'm sure, are tempted with that danger every day of your life. But it's been good. We've seen the relevancy of it. And so we're actually going to kind of end that mini-series within this series this morning. If you feel a little out of the loop, you can go on our website and check out the sermons on it from the last 2 Sundays. But the good news is that Paul this morning in our passage kind of brings it to a summary. And he even gives a little couple recap points in the beginning of our text. So it should still be a good thing for you to review. So let's go ahead and take a look at what Paul has to say. We're going to be in chapter 10, starting at verse 23. If you do not have a Bible, feel free to use one of these. These are underneath the chairs that are in front of you. And I'll be reading from page 798. So go ahead and follow along with me on the TV screens, your iPhones, what have you. Here we go. Paul, he starts off just like he's done actually 2 times already in this series. He starts off with a quote of the church in Corinth. So this is not Paul talking, he's quoting them. They're saying this, verse 23, I have the right to do anything. Paul's like, yeah, but not everything is beneficial. He says it again. I have the right to do anything. Paul says, yeah, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. So, quick recap. Paul here, he's referencing what we talked about in chapter 8, 2 chapters ago. And what he's saying there, though, is, hey, you Corinthians, you have your freedom, you have your personal rights, but just remember, don't use those at the abuse of others. And so in this context, there were people, they would go inside these temples and they would eat meat that had been sacrificed to a pagan idol. And now they knew that the idol didn't exist. It was false, it was fake, so they didn't think much of it. But there were other people in their community who used to be pagans, and that was an area of weakness for them, an area of sin, and it caused them to revert back to their lifestyle of pagan worship. And so Paul's point is simply this. Than your freedom, right? So yeah, technically you may have the right to do this, but it's not going to be for the building up of those around you. Then last week, chapter 10, right before our passage this morning, Juno talked to us about idolatry. And this is something else in this scenario. You know, they thought, hey, these false idols that are in the temples that we're eating meat from, well, they're not even real, right? Our theology is super good. We know that there's just one God. These gods are nothing. They don't exist. And he's like, well, hey, that may be true, but there's still demonic activity associated with these false idols. So be careful. Don't flirt with them too much. So he says twice, flee from idolatry. And that's why he brings up the past stories of Israel, right? They did the same thing. They flirted with the surrounding gods, and guess what? It took them down a path very far from God. And of course, Juno said, we have our own American idols today, right? We take good things like family and food and sex and money and power, and we take those good things and we make them ultimate things. And so an idol is anything more important to you than God, right? Another way of saying this is that an idol is anything that you can't stop thinking about. And so with that summary in mind, that was the last couple of weeks. Paul then kind of turns the other side of the coin here, and he actually tips the scale in favor of you using your personal freedom. So far, we've heard, hey, yeah, technically you have the freedom to do this, but really, no, you shouldn't. Don't do it. Now, this morning, he's going to say, yeah, you do have the freedom in certain ways, and oh, by the way, I actually want you to lean into it. And so this is kind of like the fun part of this section, what we can do, what we should do. So back to the text, verse 25, with that summary in mind. Paul, he says this, one of my favorite verses in the Bible, eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience. Now you have to know here, this is actually really bold and liberal of Paul to say this. Because remember, this meat that he's talking about, it was used to make a sacrifice to a pagan god. And he's saying, yeah, go ahead and eat it, just as long as you're not in the temple and thus perhaps being associated with idolatry. Eat up. Why? Next verse, verse 26. For the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Now, he's quoting here the beginning of Psalm 24, right, which was the part of Israel's like poetry, their worship music. And he uses the word everything here. And so that includes like a leg of a lamb that was in the butcher shop, right? This meat sacrificed. A modern day example of this would be, hey, yeah, have a glass of wine. It's part of God's good creation. He has made it. It's good. There's nothing wrong with it in and of itself. But of course, you know, aren't there so many Christians today in our culture? Oh, the world is bad. Like, we have to separate ourselves from it. We're good. That's all bad, right? Secular music, the Los Angeles Dodgers. No, these things are all good, minus the Dodgers, right? Or at least you can enjoy them. Enjoy them when they're losing. That's what I say. They haven't won since 1988. Come on. I'm preaching to the wrong audience. Everyone here's a Dodger fan. Oh, okay. Come on. What'd you say? Revival. Okay. Anyway, so enjoy this stuff in creation, right? It's good. There's nothing wrong with things in and of themselves. The question, though, is more of, in what context? If something leads you down a path of sin, if it's an area of weakness of you, then yeah, don't participate in it. Otherwise, eat up. He continues on, verse 27. If an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go eat whatever is put before you without raising a question. Again, talking about meat used, sacrificed to a pagan god. And he's saying, eat it. Don't even ask a question. Verse 28. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. I am referring to the other person's conscience, not yours. So, now this is where it gets a little tricky. Because if you're following along so far, you're like, whoa, hold on here. Paul just told me that I can eat meat from the marketplace, or I can eat meat that's put before me in a guest house. And now he's telling me, well, no, if someone comes up to you and says not to eat it, then don't eat it. Like, Paul, what's going on here? Make up your mind. Presumably, here's what Paul is doing. This is the situation. He's saying, hey, you go into a guest house, a non-Christian's guest house, by the way, and you got this slab of meat right in front of you, corn on the cob, side Caesar salad, and A1 with the strawberry lemonade. If you guys ever want to make that meal for me, just let me know. That's my favorite meal. Okay, so that's the situation. Now, someone comes up to you from this house, and they walk up to you, and they see the food on your meal, and they kind of look at you and say, whoa, hold on here. You're a follower of Jesus. You got this meat in front of you that was sacrificed to a pagan god. Do you know what you're doing? Like, they're actually looking out for your back here. And they're saying, hey, I know you only worship Jesus. You don't worship the other gods. That was used for the other gods. Do you know what you're eating? That's the situation here. Like, they're actually trying to protect you. They're looking out for you. They know something's off. And so Paul says, sure, okay, yes. In that situation, yeah, maybe you shouldn't eat that meat in front of you so that you don't send them a mixed message of, do you worship Jesus? Do you not? In simple terms, you don't want to come across as a hypocrite in front of them. This is the way that a missionary thinks. Use your freedom, but do it with discernment. And you want to remove every barrier that gets in the way of you being able to share Jesus with someone. And so Paul's like, that's the only situation where I'm not going to eat meat from the marketplace or in someone's house. I have every right to, but I want to remove any type of a barrier. And so the only time that I'm not eat outside the temple is actually going to be for the non-Christian. Paul then, he goes on a quick little sarcastic rant, defending his own freedom to eat this meat outside of the temple. And so he kind of says to them jokingly and a little angry, the end of verse 29, for why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? If I take part in the meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced something to thank God for? Paul's like, hey, don't judge me for eating meat outside of the temple. It's fine. You guys are being legalistic. What's more, I'm doing this for the sake of the gospel, for the advancement of God's kingdom. Here's the point. Paul isn't defending his freedom just for the sake of freedom. He's defending his freedom for the eternal freedom of others. That is Paul's main overall point. And it comes to a climax right here, verse 31. So, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everyone in every way. For I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. So do you see what Paul does here? Paul actually reframes this whole conversation of Christian liberties, right, of the gray areas, the non-essentials of the faith. In this case, whether or not it's okay to eat meat that was used in a temple to sacrifice to a god. And he basically says, if you're outside of the temple, actually, you should do it. Use your freedom for the glory of God, for the advancement of God's kingdom. Paul, again, he wants to remove every barrier that gets in the way between him and the non-Christian in the city of Corinth. And so if this means that he needs to eat meat in a guest house, eat up. He's going to do it. And you have to understand, like, Paul took heat for this. That's why this issue came up here, we think. Corinth actually wrote a letter to Paul first, and he's responding to that. They are judging him. They are criticizing him. And so on the one hand, he was very black and white with them. Yeah, don't eat the meat inside the temple. That's associated with idolatry. That's going to cause your brother or your sister to stumble. It's an area of weakness for them. But outside the temple, I'm going to do it for the gospel. Jewish people in that time period, Paul's tribe, they wouldn't have done that. Even if it was meat from the marketplace or in someone's guest house, no bueno, they would not touch it. Paul, yeah, I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it for the glory of God. To give you kind of an understanding of his train of thought here, like what's going on in his mind, that he's actually pretty pumped up about this. He virtually says the same thing a chapter earlier. Chapter 9, don't worry about turning there, I'll read it out loud for us. We saved this part for this section. So, chapter before, Paul's still talking about this issue. Verse 19, Paul says this: though I'm free and I belong to no one, right? He's got his freedom. I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jew, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. And I do this all for the sake of the gospel. There's a modern day translation, paraphrase translation. I love the way that they put this. They say, hey, this is kind of like Paul saying, whether you're religious, whether you're non-religious, whether you're like a super moral person, or you're this loose-living immoralist, whether you're weak, demoralized, whatever you are, Paul's saying, you know, I'm not going to practice your lifestyle. I'm gonna keep who I am in Christ, but boy, am I going to enter your world. Why? Chapter 9, verse 22, so he might save some. Next verse, verse 23, I do this all for the sake of the gospel. Chapter 10, verse 31, so whether you eat or drink, whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Verse 33, so that they may be saved. Now, the best part that I love about this passage as a preacher is that Paul actually gives the practical application. Chapter 11, verse 1. Pretty simple. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Now, some of you may be wondering, okay, why did I just read chapter 11, verse 1? Isn't that like a new section? Actually, all commentators are in agreement that that's actually the ending thoughts of chapter 10, right? You have to know chapters and the way they're lined up, those weren't in the original manuscripts. Those are things that scholars have gone back in and done that. So everyone's convinced that what's identified as chapter 11, verse 1 is the ending thought of chapter 10. Paul says, yeah, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. So, Paul, what's the example of Christ? I think perhaps it may be something that we see in the book of Luke. Don't worry about turning there. Luke chapter 7, verse 33 or 34, I think. 34. The Son of Man came eating and drinking. Similar words there. And you say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Jesus? God in flesh? Drunkard? Glutton? You see what's going on here? Jesus is hanging with the wrong people. Prostitutes? Tax collectors? Who are the scum of society? Although they just issued me a state refund, so. Jesus used his freedom, and it was a lot of freedom, to live as a missionary, to advance the gospel. Jesus did whatever it took to advance God's salvation. Did he take heat for it? Yeah, he got called a glutton and a drunkard. So, Paul, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Our God is a missionary God. Frankly, I think some of our lives are so boring and irrelevant and seem worthless because we don't get how grand the salvation is that Jesus gives us and calls us to invite others into. We want to spend more time criticizing, gossiping, arguing over a bunch of little gray issues, non-essentials, just like the church in Corinth did, rather than living missionally. I read a couple of studies this past week. You want to know the healthiest churches in America? The churches that embrace missional living. There's not much gossip and criticism in those churches. Why? They don't have time for that. They are so caught up in one mission, one vision to advance the kingdom in the area, they could give a rip about non-essential gray little things. Have you ever wondered why? This is a fascinating question to ask. Why doesn't Jesus just zap us into heaven? Why is he waiting around? Right? Why not just end evil right now, usher in the complete restoration of God's kingdom? Here's why. God wants you to be a co-partner with him in giving salvation. To be an ambassador, to be the means through which he saves people. That is the role of the church. The church is the primary vehicle through which God's kingdom is advanced. Church doesn't exist for itself. We are a group of missionaries who go out into this world to be the means through which God transforms lives. And so, this is the conversation that missional people have. Missionaries ask, what advances the gospel? Right? What are the barriers that get in the way that don't allow me to share Jesus? What will help me proclaim him? And we want to clear away everything that's unnecessary and unbiblical for the sake of that. And so this becomes a lifestyle And it's going to look different for all of us, right? We have lawyers, business leaders, school teachers, students, retired folks. We got pastors. So it's going to look different. And thank God for that, right? Boring if we're all the same. So for me, as a pastor, right, what does this mean? And I got to tell you, every time that I go out to a neighborhood party, a concert, a sporting event, I know exactly what's going to happen 10 minutes into the conversation with a new person. Happens every time. So, Mark, like, what do you do for a living? Yeah, so I'm like this, spiritual leader who helps people live fulfilling lives. No, I don't say that. I say I'm a pastor. Because I know by the time that I've gotten to that conversation, I will have done a couple intentional things by that point. If it's the right setting, I may have a beer in my hand by that point already. If I'm at a concert, I'm going to be really enjoying the music that's going on there, and it's not Christian music. If it's a sporting event, I'm going to be talking trash and engaging in sports with them. Right? I just want to show them I'm a normal dude who does normal things with normal people. And I want to remove every negative stereotype that a pastor's going to have to an unchurched person. I want to remove every barrier. So for the sports fan, man, I'm going to be the best sports fan that he's ever been around, or she, not to be sexist. What's that? Yes, that's certainly part of this conversation. Right? If, who loves a beer, I'm going to go get a beer with him then. If there's a friend of mine who doesn't know Jesus and he loves Indian food, and he's like, hey, Mark, will you come go get an authentic meal with me? Now, if you know me, I do not like spicy food. I'm a sissy. True story. I did this 8 months ago here in Artesia. And so I had a meal with this guy. My eyebrows are cringing. My face is turning red. I think I ordered 15 glasses of water. This dude was looking at me like I was crazy. Then I went home. My wife put up with the after effects of it for the next couple of days, if you get my drift. Right? But I'll tell you what, I get into some fascinating things because I live this way. And I'm not putting myself up on a pedestal. I'm not doing that at all. Right? But I'm able to engage in people and minister to them on their terms. Now, I want to be also super clear here. If you have a history of alcohol, if you're an alcoholic, if it causes you to sin or someone else, should you be engaging with that? No, absolutely not. For me, that's not a weakness of mine. There's not a history of alcoholism in my immediate family. I always do it in moderation. I'm over 21. Although I always get asked if I'm the youth pastor. Right? It's not an area of weakness for me or those around me when I'm doing it. If you struggle with lust, should you go start a ministry to strippers? No. I just want to be clear here. And some of this is just common knowledge, I think. But I don't want to get any emails afterwards. Right? Send your emails to Juno, not me. We don't want to be influenced by culture. We want to influence culture. All of us have weaknesses, so don't put yourself in those situations. Using your freedom requires discernment. But in your areas of freedom, in your areas of strength, whether you eat or drink, do it for the glory of God. Crazy statement for Paul to make, right? We think it's just some nice, that's a Christian bumper sticker, a verse I always see on cars, a little thank you note. Maybe that's something that you say to your son right before his first Little League game. Hey, Johnny, go swing the bat for Jesus. Do it for his glory. I'm going to say that. Whatever it takes, man. Paul, that's not the context he's using it in. He's saying, use your Christian liberties in the non-essential gray areas, use those for the advance of the gospel. The best modern cultural translation that I can think of this is, get a beer, but if you're going to do it with someone who doesn't know Jesus so that you can invest in them. There's a lot of guys out there who will never step foot in here on a Sunday morning at 9:30. You'll get a drink with them, though, at a restaurant, a lounge, different game. Or you'll hear real quick what their struggles are. Real quick. So you see how following Jesus, it reframes like how we look at our purpose and our relationships. So if you're going to eat or drink, whatever you do it for the glory of God. I mean, I've even flirted with this idea of getting a tattoo. That sounds funny. I'm being serious, though. There are people in my generation who have sleeves of tattoos, and they would feel absolutely judged and criticized if they came in a church on a Sunday morning. They feel out of place. Actually, I had someone tell me this 4 days ago, so I know it's real. There's nothing wrong with a tattoo. Nowhere in Scripture. Now, if your conscience tells you there's something wrong with it, fine, then don't go on. That's fine. Right? And we can ask the same questions about, should Christians listen to only Christian music, the Fish, or non-secular music, or secular music? Right? Can a Christian see a PG-13 or an R-rated movie? I'm not going to address that in detail because I just want to say, use the same lens that Paul gives us. If it's an area of weakness for you, if it's going to cause you to sin or someone around you, then don't engage in it. But if it's not, then engage in it so that you can share Jesus with someone. Right? Be honest too. So if you're Juno, our lead pastor, loves Neil Diamond, God bless him. Take a bunch of non-Christians to a Neil Diamond concert in a non-church arena, rock out with them, enjoy the music, invest in Jesus with them. Now, maybe that's a bad example because sometimes I think Neil Diamond is so bad that it's sinful. I'll be catching some heat for that, but it's okay. Here's what I'm saying. Rather than making the driving question for issues of non-essentials, is this biblical or not? Why don't you make the driving question, is this an avenue for me to expand the kingdom? And all of a sudden, you're actually thinking far less about yourself and far more about God and his ways. A follower of Jesus, a missionary, thinks that way. My wife and I have a new recent friend. And she told my wife of a story at work. Apparently there's this girl there, a co-worker of hers. She's been able to have some spiritual conversations with her. This friend knows that our friend is a Christian. And so this girl asked her, hey, why don't you come work out with me, do some exercise classes outside of work? Now, the beautiful thing about this is that this new friend of ours saw this as an opportunity to engage with this girl for the sake of Jesus. Did she have to do this? Did it make her, from what I understand, so much more hectic because she had to get up at before 5:45 in the morning so that she could be at work on time? Yeah. But she's doing it for the kingdom. And I don't mean any of this as like a guilt trip. Right? I struggle with this too. Pastors are usually the most unmissional people, and that should be the opposite. So I don't mean it as a trip. But living missionally, it requires intentionality. To have the friendships that Jesus did, right? With those who don't know him for the sake of changing that. And this will seem like a chore to you until The gospel, the good news of Jesus, it penetrates your heart from the inside out. The person and work of Jesus is the greatest motivation, foundation to live this out. That's why Paul says at the end, imitate Christ. Take a good long stare at Jesus, and you're going to see the greatest missionary who ever lived. And he entered your world at his expense and freedom so that he could save you. So I just have a couple questions for us to end. Right? I did this 2 weeks ago. I just want you to chew on these, reflect on them, pray through them throughout the week. 3 questions. Here's the first. Do you view yourself as a missionary? We in the church, we think missionaries are just those people who raise money and then fly overseas and work in a third world country. Yeah, they're missionaries, but so are you. A follower of Jesus is a missionary. That's part of what it means to follow Jesus. Question number 2. Who are your non-Christians in your life? Like, where are they? They in your neighborhood? At work? They in your child or your grandchild's baseball team? Where are they? And if you don't have any non-Christian friends, the first place to check is your neighborhood. I've never lived in a neighborhood that's all Christians. That was the case, honestly, it'd probably be a little weird. Third question. What are the barriers between you and the non-Christians that you know? What stops you? What's an obstacle that gets in the way? Can I just say that perhaps bringing them on a Sunday morning is actually probably a pretty big barrier? Most people who don't know Jesus are not going to show up here on a Sunday morning until you've built a relationship up with them on their turf. And that's okay. Because church is Monday through Saturday. We are missionaries who eat the equivalent of meat outside of the temple, just like Paul did. And so we're going to move into our response time now. The music team is going to come up. We're going to collect our offering. One of the reasons why we tithe here at the church, and Christians do across the world, is so that we can live missionally, so that we can minister to the community. And so if New Life is family for you, this is part of worship. We have communion up here. If you want to take communion, be reminded that Jesus exercised his freedom so that he could set you free. We have candles to declare that there is light in darkness. There's a prayer team in the back. They would love to pray with you for anything. But let's respond to what God is doing. So at this time, if I could invite the ushers forward.